All right, hi and welcome back to our training. We just wrapped up with the essential components of a graph, and we're going to move on to ways to analyze a graph visually. So, we're going to talk about three important things first. We're going to talk about variability, level of behavior, and trend of behavior. So I hope you have your SAFMED cards ready because we're going to make some SAFMEDs for them. All right, so first we're going to start off with variability. Variability refers to the extent to which measures of behavior under the same environmental conditions differ from one another. Fewer data points will be sufficient when there is a high degree of stability in the data. When a lot of variability in performance occurs during a given condition, additional data are needed before moving to a new condition. All right. So, for example, this is really important when we talk about baseline data, when we stop baseline data, and when it's appropriate to begin an intervention, or when it's appropriate to stop an intervention and begin a new intervention, or return to baseline if you're doing a reversal design. Because if a behavior is in fluctuation when you initially assess it during baseline, and there's a high level of variability and you implement a treatment, how do you really know whether or not the treatment's having an effect? It's a lot easier to determine the contingency or the effect that the treatment has on the behavior if you wait until that behavior comes to a level or little variability. And that way, when you implement the treatment and the behavior either increases or decreases or stays the same, you can more reliably say that the treatment was the cause for the change in the behavior. All right, so let's create a SAFMED card, variability. Variability is the extent to which measures of behavior under the same condition differ from one another. Variability. Wonderful. So now I'm going to show you some differences in variability. Let's take a peek at this graph. Okay. First, let's see. We can call this our title. It's for Jane. And what is our x-axis telling us? What numbers are on there? What information is displayed? Days, okay, and it's going in increments of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then what is our y-axis telling us? It's telling us a percent correct, okay, and then the numbers are going up by tens, 10%, 20%, 30%. So my guess is this is something to do with an academic rating scale, maybe tests that she's getting. Now look at our data. Is it variable or is it stable? Pretty stable, right? She's maintaining a stable level within the 80s. You'd say that she's probably a B student. She's not all over the place. Good. Now let's switch to a different graph. Meet Matt. Okay, same graph. How is he doing? Are his test scores variable or are they stable? Pretty variable. He is all over the place, right? Good. All right, so let's take a look at a different type of graph. How about this one? What's the title of our graph here? Blood glucose. Good. And this says minutes after starting eating. It looks like this has some variability in it, right? In comparison to this, that is fairly stable. However, it's not as variable as our friend Matt here, because at least in this graph, we have a pretty steady, I mean, it's a sharp incline, right? So it's spiking fast, but it's a steady. It's not up and down, 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 every single one. But there is some variability in this. Okay, and then we'll take a peek at this line graph. We have three baselines, or we have three phase lines, excuse me. One baseline in this graph. Take a peek and see where they are. They're right here. 1, 2. There are three different phases. We have baseline. We have the second phase, which is 1 milligram of medication, and phase 3, which is 2 milligrams of medication. And our x-axis is also assessing by days, although it looks like it's going up in threes. And then over here we have number of checks. And that's going up in increments of 5. Looking at this graph, which phase is most variable? If you said baseline, you're correct. Okay, there's a high amount of variability. It's going up and down, up and down. But then we have some stability. It's still pretty variable, but at least not every single point on this day line here is an alternate of an up or down change in the direction. Okay, all the way to 2 milligrams of medication, which has some slight variability, but it's still kind of following the same pattern. Okay, there isn't a huge amount of variance in between each point. All right, so that's our variability. Let's move on to the next important factor of our graph, and that is level of behavior. The evaluation of the level of a behavior refers to the increase or decrease in a behavior from the beginning to an end of the phase. It is important to evaluate the magnitude and direction of change that has occurred before moving to a new condition. The bigger level of change that occurs, the more powerful the effect of the intervention had, right? So say you were teaching a kiddo to identify sight words, and you did some initial tests just to see what sight words they had. Maybe it started off, they have 4 sight words. Okay, maybe simple like a, at, me, and then after which you implemented a reading intervention where each day you sat with this kiddo and for about 5 minutes you went through some flashcards of sight words, okay? And then after a day of doing that, you retested and you found out that they now have 7 sight words. So the level of sight word acquisition is starting to change. Now, if you implemented that strategy of using the flashcards to study, and then all of a sudden they went from 4 sight words to 50 sight words, you were like, wow, that is the best studying technique ever. Not plausible, right? But huge effect. Awesome intervention. We got to put it in all our schools. Not likely, but it's all right. So you can say that there was a huge effect of that intervention. And that's why we look at the different levels of behavior, whether it is having a good effect or a bad effect. Okay, so new staff med card, levels of behavior. So our definition here would be evaluation of the visual display of behavior as it increases, decreases, or stays the same. From beginning to end of a phase. All right, levels of behavior. Wonderful. Okay. The third most important part to visually analyzing a graph is trend. Trend comes from analyzing a behavior across time and seeing to what degree the ratio of the x over y, or the trend or increase or decrease in our behavior is going. Okay? The higher a slope, when we look at our trend, we can say the faster a behavior is changing, which kind of also plays into our level of behavior, right? So the higher our trend, most likely the higher level or change in behavior has occurred. All right, so let me give you some examples. This is what we would call a stable trend. Okay, it's not increasing, it's not decreasing. If you were to draw a line about through the middle of the points, it's staying the same, it's staying level. This is what we call an increasing or ascending trend. Our data points are going up. It's a positive slope. Okay? Now, we also have a decreasing trend. Our slope is going down. Then last but not least, this one that you just saw is variable or no trend. That's when data points are kind of everywhere. Okay? So when you're looking at trend, it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing that the trend is increasing or decreasing. It's totally dependent on the behavior for measure, right? Because sometimes we want to measure a behavior that we want to decrease, such as instances of aggression to people. So if that were your behavior of concern and you were visually analyzing the graph, you would hope that the level of behavior is decreasing over time and our trend is negative. But if it was a positive skill or behavior that we wanted to increase, such as sight word acquisition, then we would hope our trend would be the opposite, right? It would be an increasing trend or a positive trend. All right, good. So let's make a SAFMEDS card. Trend. Our definition: visually analyzing a graph to attain if the behavior is increasing, decreasing, or stable, and at what rate. And rate is also a key part of that, because remember, if we talked about this, if you started off with your SAFMEDS graph by only knowing maybe 4 terms correct on your first trial, the first time you tested yourself, and then after studying, you all of a sudden shot up to 8 and then 16, wow. That would be a pretty big incline, okay? And we would say our rate of change is really high. But if you started off with 4 and then the next time you tested yourself, you went to 6, and then the next time you tested yourself, maybe you went to about 5, so you dropped down a little bit, then you came back up to 6, then 8, then 6, then 10, then we would say that your slope and your trend is still an increasing trend, okay? But progress is slow and steady. So maybe you need to study a little bit more. Maybe we need to change that intervention. All right. So those are our 3 important visual analysis tools when it comes to graphing. All right. Before we wrap up our analysis of graphs, I wanted to touch on just 2 other types of graphs that are pretty typical to come across within the behavioral analysis field and setting. I'm sure you've seen these before. I'll show you a nice visual cheat sheet here. It's bright and colorful. So we've been discussing line graphs, okay? Line graphs is really demonstrating how variable our behavior is across time, right? Because we can assess it via trend, via level, and really analyze that variability and change. Other graphs are useful as well, but they might not offer all 3 of those components. So for example, we have bar graphs. Bar graphs are fantastic because we can take different categories or different variables and compare them to one another, okay? But we're not comparing one of those variables and how it changes over time, like our line graph. The same can be said for pie graphs. A pie graph is similar to a bar graph in that you can compare and contrast different variables or categories within a certain set of things and see how much of it takes up. But again, you're not able to analyze any of that information over time. Okay? So that's the big bonus to using a line graph, is that we can use it across the interventions that we implement in our ABA fields. All right. so that about wraps up our graph portion. Now we're going to move on to our SAFMEDs, and then we're going to revisit graphing by plotting our first few tests within our line graph here.